to talk to you about one of the consequences of the volatility that we've been experiencing in the industry, especially since about 2004. We really had in the 90s a very calm. 98 was not very calm, neither was 94, but we had a very calm market horizon that we operated on. The only time we really got into trouble is when we overproduced. You know, we overproduced, prices went down, and if you overproduced dramatically, prices went down dramatically. And we had the big building boom in the 90s. There was no way to really tell if we were getting too many out there until we had too many out there and the market crashed. But now, because of a series of events, including the kind of the birth of ethanol into our system and the tremendous role now that exports play. I can recall in 1995, I believe, was the first year in about 30 that we were net positive on exports. And we were, you know, championing that, oh, we're an exporter now and all this business. Well, now, of course, it's a critical part of the total amount that we produce. And even though we had this, I called it a calm horizon, this steadily increasing amount of exports, now all of a sudden we have these exogenous factors which drop our exports in the last few years and make them rise again. And so we're bringing new sources of risk, especially into crops. And now, even though, who's that, there used to be the chief economist at Wells Fargo, used to predict a recession every 6 months, and then about every 10 years he was right. But there is finally a drought of significant proportions, which certain weather forecasting climatologists at universities had been forecasting for about 15 years, and it finally did hit. So those kinds of things cause us to have a lot of increased risk. Now, I want to show you the particular dilemma that we have when we try to understand that and make investments going forward, or try to understand what our cost of production is going to be. And then we're going to look at a particular example of trying to mitigate some of this with the use of DDGS, mainly as an example of a particular strategy and what might and could go wrong with it and so forth. And so it's not so much about that as more an illustration. This work really is done with Aaron Gaines at the Mashoffs, who's their nutritionist. Probably most of you know him. Although I've added some stuff to it, I'm still leaving him on there so he can suffer the pain in case I really mess up bad along with me and kind of divide up things. Well, we know feed ingredient prices have really undergone a lot of additional volatility. And part of it is we reach certain tipping points in the world with respect to demand and capacity to produce. We've reached we've had a tremendous growth in income in the so-called BRIC nations, which have caused demand for food as well as for cars and petroleum and so on. And we've had government policies that are trying to reduce the future risk of dependency on, say, imported oil, which have brought government policy to bear and caused more volatility too. In fact, I go as far to say now, unless we have a record crop every year, we really are in danger of stocks-to-use problems at the end. We've really gotten ourselves in a position, because of the amount that's being taken off the table by ethanol production, that unless we have record crops each year, we run some risk of stocks-to-use problems, the pantry being bare. Now, during the 90s and so forth, that typically was not a problem, although 95 was kind of a classic problem of a shortage. But we almost always had storage. You know, we had more than we needed storage that carried over to the next year, which kept prices low and so on. That's kind of a thing of the past. And I really would encourage you not to get lulled into a false sense of security by these lowering corn prices. Although I'm going to leave it to you in a minute here to make your choice about what you think is going to happen. I just put this graph together in annual numbers to get rid of the noise of the volatility in monthlies and weeklies. But what you're looking at here is corn price and a pass through into hog prices. So the bottom one, the scales are, you have to be a little bit careful in how you interpret the scales. On the right are the corn price per bushel. On the left is the hog price. These are 2 or 3 hog prices. So you see they're really tracking themselves together. There's not that much difference between them, like the Western Corn Belt and so on. Then this is the corn price. And during the time of tremendous profitability associated with exports, and you'll notice a decreasing corn price. Really the last time, except for this little blob, that we had a fall in corn prices. We had tremendous profitability here. You see this sort of gap open. And then as we moved into 2008 and 2009, corn prices escalated dramatically while hog prices were flat. And I probably led in 2008 and 2009 to some of the most challenging years maybe in the history of the business for those who didn't successfully lock margins prior to that period. I think $25 to $40 a head losses were not uncommon in the Midwest when we had this sort of pinching period here. Then the more normal situation is to see them run together. And then this counter move last year was a result of the drought. So we have corn prices rising into falling hog prices, which is not a typical situation. Normally we'll see a pass-through, although it may take several months to work its way through, of higher corn prices into higher hog prices. Mainly because today, in today's industry or the modern industry, producers adjust dramatically. We used to talk about once we had the concrete down, producers couldn't really adjust their production. Well, if the adjustment takes place in weights, and for many producers, it's pretty dramatic. And early marketings is how you bring the weight down. I think you remember from last summer when it looked like a really challenging period developing in the fall. There was rapid and immediate early marketings, which really caused that situation to be much better than it would have been otherwise. Now, future price distributions of feed ingredients, that's what I want you to think about now. Because in the work that I do for some of the producers I work for now, and these are fairly large companies, we really do a lot of work with risk management and trying to understand what the next 3 to 5 years will look like. So we're not forecasting point estimates for corn. We're trying to forecast the distribution of outcomes. And I really have sort of coined the phrase, all the world is a distribution. You should really think of everything as a distribution. I talk about being a husband or a father. I like to ask people, do you think you're a good spouse? How are you as a spouse? And it kind of depends on the last interaction you had with your spouse as to what you choose to say. If you got up kind of grumpy this morning, go, well, maybe I could do a little better. And, if you woke up this morning and you had roses on the breakfast cart, then it's like, yeah, I'm not too bad. So the truth of the matter, though, is we have a distribution of behaviors toward each other, toward our spouses, toward our children. And the tails of those distributions were sometimes exceptionally good, sometimes were exceptionally negative. We could call a film crew for cops and have them come out and get some film of us yelling and screaming, got a domestic dispute at the DiPietre household. But most of the time we're kind of in that middle range, where we're pretty good or where we're okay. Well, it's essential really to begin to think of the world in those kinds of distributions in order to understand and make investments in this highly volatile kind of environment that we're in. So I want you to look, this is updated, by the way, on a daily basis through yesterday. This is corn prices for the last 20 years, from August 15th of 2003 through 13. And you see the same picture for soybean meal. This is high pro Decatur soybean meal. Now this turns out to be just a 10-year. I have the 20-year too, but it didn't really add much. These are 10-year pictures. And what I want you to think about is, in this gray space right here, what are we going to see? Well, we already got a little bit of a preview, right? This. But if we were to think of the next 3 to 5 years, oh, by the way, before we take a look at what that might be, I put corn and DDGS now on a ton basis, corn on a ton basis too, and soybean meal. So you got corn, soybean meal, and DDGS on a per ton basis, and the two here are the corn and DDGS. Here's the soybean meal prices. So you can kind of see how the movements have been and how they've tracked each other. Now, this is a look at the multi-state corn price per ton and multi-state DDGS prices. And you'll see they kind of cluster. These ones that are all the same sort of color are the, I believe, the DDGS prices. These are the corn prices. And the question I have for you now, where you see those red lines, is when we look out here into the next 5 years or so, will it be looking like this? Will it be this pattern repeating itself? Or will it return to this lower level pattern now that the drought is over? So you see, there's three possibilities there. When I look at trying to model so that I can give some confidence intervals around forecasts that firms are going to really put millions of dollars into investments in, the question becomes, what is the pathway corn prices are going to take? What is the pathway soybean meal prices are going to take? And then trying to understand what the implications would be if they stay really on this plateau, or if they return to this longer term pattern, which is the 5-year pattern, or this return to kind of this situation here. And the answer you give there can have some pretty dramatic counterindications on how you invest or how you decide to go forward. Now, one of the most interesting pictures that you can see here, when we think of corn prices, or really the distribution of anything, there's a process going on which generates them. A risky process goes on that generates corn prices every day. The risk of whether it'll rain in Iowa at the right time when pollination is taking place. The risk that the Chinese will suddenly want corn and the exchange rates will be right and they'll try to come and get some. Or, the risk that we'll have a particularly wet fall and we can't get into the field until we have lots of field losses. There's a lot of stuff that can go on, and it's a biological process combined with weather and public policy and exchange rates with respect to the export market. So you have all those processes generating corn prices out, right? And what we try to do when we're forecasting the future of those is to try to create a mathematical representation of that in a distribution which mimics that sort of volatile mix of what we think is happening next. Now, if you look at the price per ton of corn, and it could be the bushel, you would get exactly the same pattern. But the price of ton per corn during the last 5-year period, what you really see is two different distributions, right? The so-called bell-shaped sort of distribution is what everybody's mostly familiar with. So we ask ourselves, in this last 5-year period, were there two separate processes going on so that I have to pick the processes that's likely to continue? Which one of those is the process which will continue? Or is it really that is the process and we better model it by doing something like this, a distribution which has this long tail because we have a so-called bimodal distribution, one that has two peaks in it, and we can model it with this this sort of bent distribution, and pull our corn prices out of that. Well, then you kind of sit down and you have to begin to talk about what generated this and what generated that. And by the way, these are not in date order as we move from left to right. They're in, here's a real technical term for you, the highness of the corn price, the high or low of the corn price. So in other words, this could have occurred in 2008, and this could have occurred in the late 2008 or something, and this could be 2011 and then 12 here. It's just a map of all the prices that occurred during that period, right? Which one do we use? Then if we go back to the 10-year period, this is the 5-year period. Now we go back to the 10-year period, look what happens. It looks like we have 3 processes going on, right? We have a trimodal distribution, and the question is this old hat, or should we sort of look at this, or are these the 2 extremes? So we kind of pull out and mathematically model that middle section, and then pull prices from it as we look at modeling the future. So the whole picture of this that I really wanted to get everybody thinking about was that the prices you face really come from this mix of forces that have a picture to them. They cause pictures in the prices when you put them together like this. And kind of knowing and understanding what is likely to come next gives you hopefully a leg up on being able to make wise decisions, or at least understand the probability around your decision. We're going to look a minute at how wrong you could be from relying on the mean. And the mean, as you know, in statistics and mathematics is called the expected value. So, if we take a look at the average, the mean, it's called the expected value. But I'm sure you've heard me say you could have 2 kids, twins, that bring home their midterm notice to meet with the teacher, and they both have a 50% average, and you're kind of upset, but twins, you'd expect them to have the similar grades. When you get in there, they've had 2 tests, and one has a 0 and a 100, one has a 49 and a 51. And you go, whoa, there's really 2 different things going on here, but if we only look at the average, they look a lot alike, right? So we got to plow below the average a little bit to kind of understand the mechanism that's generating that average, you see, because those 2 situations with the kids probably call for 2 very different actions or corrections or whatever to sort of fix. We can look at soybean meal prices. Now, this really is bimodal too. It's just not, the frequency here is not that great, but you see that little hump there? It's bimodal in the same way corn is, just not quite as exaggerated. Now, well, we'll get to it in a minute, but we can kind of jump ahead here. The mean over this period for soybean meal, high-pro soybean meal, was $354, and the standard deviation was $66. So, can anybody give me kind of an ordinary language definition of a standard deviation? Probably not, okay. I mean, I would never risk it if I were sitting where you were at. But it's actually not too difficult. In fact, over at Snedeker Hall, if my first graduate statistic instructor had told me it this way, my down-home Missouri brain would have figured out statistics a lot faster than I did. All a standard deviation is, first of all, standard is another word for mean. So it's the average deviation that any one single price might have from the expected value. So we know when we put all the values together and get an average, we can take any individual value that went into the average and measure how far it was from the average, right? And if you do that for every single element that went into the average, and then take an average of those deviations, that's the average amount that everything that went into the average missed the average. So in a sense, what it really tells you is if you rely on the average as your expected value, you can expect to be wrong about the amount of the standard deviation, right? So if you were to plug in, like we all seem to do when we do these flat models, 354 is my ongoing expected price of soybean meal. Even over the period that we mentioned it, you could expect when you use that and pick any one price out that might occur to you in the next year, you're going to be up to 66 bucks or about 66 bucks wrong. And that wrong could be on either side, above or below. So now you got $122 range around it, right? You see why all the world is a distribution and why we have to begin thinking of things in terms of distributions? I keep trying to get my doctor to think in terms of distributions. He doesn't like me very much. In fact, he periodically sends me letters telling me to find my health care somewhere else. I should have brought one and put it up there, but I go back just to torture him usually. But, you know, he's so locked into his 1990s check your brain at the door if you're a patient mode, you know. And I keep explaining to him that his so-called normal values of all these tests are really, they all have distributions around them, depending on who you are and all that stuff. And medicine is so much easier when you have these, you know, point breaks where you can say, you know, your sugar level is X, and so you're pre-diabetic or you're, you know, insulin resistant or something like that, which I'm not, by the way, luckily, so far. But he's threatening me that I will be. So, you know, all the world is a distribution, and even in critical things like that, I think we have to look at it that way. Soybean meal prices, same thing. If you look over the longer period, you have kind of that trimodal distribution, if not 5 little points out there. So are there 5 processes, and which is the process, or is the process sort of a 5-headed Medusa monster? All right. Well, one thing we can look at is whether the correlation between the principal feed ingredients, corn and soybean meal, has been changing over time. And you'll find that the correlation between hogs and corn, which is this value, is really not changing very much. In fact, it's become stronger in the 5-year, most recent 5 years, most recent 10 years, most recent 20 years. Okay? And then these are soybean meal correlations to hogs. Soybean meal prices used to be very correlated to hogs and have kind of fallen off in soybean meal in their correlation to the hog price in the recent period. So you begin to put some clues together to try to decide, you know, what these distributions might look like in the next 3 to 5 years. And so what you wind up doing is correlating corn and soybean meal prices over the period that you're going to take your distribution from. If it's like the last 5 years, the last 10 years, and so on, you find the correlation. Then when you forecast it out in the future, you want to make sure that your forecast has those corn and soybean meal prices in that same correlation. That's why it's important to understand how those things are changing. So this is, to me, and believe me, I understand this, I'm an economist, an interesting picture. May not be to you at all. But what I did was I took, I believe, the last 5 years' distributions of corn and soybean meal, and I found their correlation. And then I just ran a quick Monte Carlo simulation where I said, all right, draw me 5,000 corn and soybean meal price pairs that I could face going forward if this distribution is true, that these are the forces which are creating these. And make sure when you got all 5,000 of them drawn, they're correlated in the way that they were in the last 5 years too. That is, when one goes up, the other goes up, or one goes down, the other goes down, and how strong. So it picked pairs of corn and soybean meal that were correlated in the way they were the last 5, I believe the last 5 years, yes. And when you look at that, there's something important to notice here. It's kind of like that old deal my wife always talks about. For some reason, we never get too much change from somebody, but we sometimes get shortchanged. And go, why is that distribution always skewed to I'm getting the shaft, and my payday side of it never seems to come? Well, if you look at this, you can see the density. If you're trying to plan kind of what combinations of corn and soybean meal are likely to come at you, and so you can sort of see the distribution of returns. Everything besides corn and soybean meal is kind of a constant. Just add your constant on, right? The cost of your buildings and labor and all that. So it's the cost of feed plus a constant will get you a pretty good forecast. Most of them you want to test are in this area, but when you have a breakout, do you see something consistent about where the breakout goes? Yeah, it doesn't go randomly in every direction out of there, does it? Oops. All the blowouts are on the upside. And the reason for that is, can you imagine the situation where, given the amount of ethanol, for instance, that corn that's being taken away from the market, that we'd have a crop big enough that it would send corn prices back to $1 again with the same amount of usage by pigs and everything. We just don't have that even bumper crop sends corn down to nothing, drought sends it way up. We have kind of this bottom end that's supported by 42% taken off by ethanol, so that no matter how big the crop is, it never drives it low, but if it's short, Katie bar the door, right? So when we're thinking about risk management, and remember that kind of skewed distribution that we were looking at back here? That tells the story. You see this distribution, notice that there's nothing here in the distribution, right? There's sort of this bell-shaped thing, but then this long tail out to the high side. And that's what you're seeing in that breakout. You're really seeing these observations. So you want to plan with these, but be ready for a strategy in the rare but real case that we have a blowout. All right, subsidized production and mandated use, both of them together, and then, upping that to trying to get E15 going and E20, all that in the cars, has really reduced U.S. dependence on foreign sources of fuels, but it's also led to dramatic increases in demand for corn for fuel production. I always like to say that, 15 years ago, if you would have told everybody in this room that 40% of the U.S. corn crop was going to disappear from your use forever, I think it would be like one of Pharaoh's plagues. People would have went, oh my God, what the hell are we going to do? We need to get some kind of research going fast to come out with some kind of alternatives, right? But in that's in fact where we find ourselves now, with that kind of percentage off the table. As of 2011, ethanol now exceeds in the United States all livestock uses, not just pigs, but any livestock use of corn, and it'll be over 40% probably in this year. Now, everybody used to sort of say, well, we tied corn to oil prices, and to a certain extent that happened for a short period of time. But again, there are too many of these exogenous shocks that come in, like in 2008 and 9, the depression, and then the global sort of fall off in demand for oil didn't stop the mandated escalation in the use of ethanol. So when the world got sick and the demand for oil slowed down and price stabilized and went flat, corn demand went up, and corn had a drought. You don't really have a drought in an oil field, right? So all of a sudden you have these other outside factors which cause this flattening. The dotted line is oil. Caused this flattening of the oil and these jumps in corn and DDGS prices. Well, now and this always amazes me too, and I just sort of chuckle when I hear it, but a lot of people in the Midwest, you know, when I talk to them, I said, do you realize that, you know, this ethanol thing has doubled, tripled your price of corn, and more? And they go, well, yeah, but we got the DDGS kind of coming back in to, you know, help us out. And I go, man, kick somebody as hard as you can between the legs and then offer them this little tidbit, you know, as a salve, and they kind of go, So, and anyway, it just amazes me what hog producers are willing to put up with, and without getting upset. Otherwise, I guess you would all have no hair and no anything else left. But we can look at a strategy, and of course, all these strategies have their concomitant problems. We can look at a strategy of replacing corn and soybean meal with DDGS, but when you get too much in, we all know that bacon takes a hit, right? The fat in the pork gets soft. And that's a problem because this is yesterday's prices off, well, whatever the new report is, used to be the LS 500, the carcass price report. And you see the belly, you know, really at historic all-time highs and at historic differentials to the rest of the carcass. So bacon is king, again. And so anything you do to the bacon is going to get a lot of negative attention if you're not improving it. Now, because of extraneous forces, again, that generate distributions of prices, what I'm showing you here is a ratio of corn price per ton to DDGS price per ton. So when it's high like that, it means corn is really relatively valuable compared to DDGS, right? So if you can pull corn out of a ration and put distiller's grain in, that was a good thing to do. It was very economical to do, up to a point where your packer began to get nervous about you, right, and kind of corrected you. But notice what's happened here since 2011. The corn price versus DDGS, you know, has deteriorated quite a bit. In fact, I looked yesterday and we're about at 0.9 in the Midwest. So, you know, we're even farther down the way. This ends at somewhere near the beginning of this year. We're down into here. Now, what has happened is relatively predictable, and there are some other factors that happen, but in general, you hear me talk about precision agriculture all the time. When you sell a commodity combination product like DDGS, it actually has a lot of sub-products in it which have more value than it is if you can mine them out of there, like fat and oils and fiber. You know, if you can pull them all out and sell them separately, it's worth more than the combination as a kind of a waste product, you know, from the distilling process. So wherever there's a way to make a buck, you know, people will eventually follow that on. And there's been a lot of sort of mining of DDGS, and so its value has gone up relative to what it was as sort of a waste product back in the golden days. And it's made it less valuable to as a hedge against high corn prices. I call that the squeeze. You know, we're kind of getting lazy depending on that substitution to take place, and we kind of got the squeeze. Let's look at the trade-off now. You know that iodine is the iodine value. IV is what is measured in the carcass to see if the fat has become too polyunsaturated or unsaturated, so that it's kind of droopy. The bacon becomes droopy, doesn't slice well, all that sort of stuff. We looked at, this is Dr. Gaines, Aaron Gaines helped put all this together, but we looked at different rations of 0, 20, or 10, 20, 30% inclusion of DDGS, and they were all formulated to be isocaloric on a net energy basis, which means basically we're not changing their nutritional value. They'll produce the same feed efficiency and equal growth rate, although he noted that you had to put in some choice white grease to make the supplementation work. And in his formulation, he used the NRC 2012. And I'm just going to flash these diets up just to verify that we did them. We're not going to spend any time there, obviously. But those are those mix of diets, corn, soy, and then 10, 20, and 30% diets. Now, again, before we look at how they trade off for each other, as we think about the risk of those price relationships in the trade-off and how that trade-off works, I want you to focus again on the standard deviation of each of these elements as well as the mean. If you look at the corn price, the average corn price over that period of 2008 to 2012, it's $5.26 a bushel, $1.88 a ton, but $1.56 is the standard deviation. So if we're again forecasting and modeling the next 2 or 3 years, and we're going to use $5 corn, more than likely at any one forecast that we make, we could be as much as $1.50 off, which is a pretty big number, if we rely on just a single point forecast. That's why nowadays I produce for clients the distribution of likely outcomes. So we can say 20% of the time we expect your cost of production to be below this level, 30% below this level, 40% below that level. That way we can kind of get an idea of the stability of it and realize that it's a moving target like we all know it is. But remember the good old days, like for 10 or 15 years to produce a hog was 37 cents. I think I remember Sonny Faison saying that was the helicopter and everything thrown in. Oh no, that was Julie Mashoff. After Sonny said something like, well, that was the plane and everything thrown in. And Julie said, well, our cost of production in the Midwest is 38, and that's our helicopter thrown in. So those were the good old days, aren't they? Neither one of those people probably said any of that. I mean, I can't tell you the number of plane rides and missed nights that I had. Soybean meal, 66, again, is kind of your error. DDGS, 55, a much bigger variation around DDGS. So, if I'm going to forecast the likely savings from substituting distiller's grain into the diet, I don't want to do it as a point forecast, although I'll give you the mean. I want to do it as a distribution of likely outcomes. So what I've done is from the data that you saw before, we developed this corn price distribution. This is the one we think we face. A lot of density around these values, but breakout as possible to the high side. Same thing for DDGS, same thing for soybean meal. So you see we're using that kind of shape of a distribution as the shape of what's to come. No downside, but a smaller probability of an upside in those prices. And then we can develop this table so that here are your predicted iodine values, and I think 75 becomes kind of the critical value with many packers, which is why they kind of mostly stop you at 30% in at least some of the later diets in finishing. But notice as you put more, let's look at the increase now. As you put more DDGS in, these are additional pounds in the diet, you're raising the unsaturated nature of the fat in the animal, but you're lowering the cost of corn. Notice we're taking out corn and we're taking out soybean meal. So the cost of production of the pig falls as you increase DDGS. Now, that's not the current relationship between corn and DDGS, but the mean of the distribution of the relationship of corn and DDGS. Like, how do they mess around with each other over a 5-year period rather than picking the one today? It always amazes me. I do work for all, really, of the major pharmaceutical companies, periodically for BI and sometimes for Elanco and others. And they'll have a product come out, and they'll want me to do an economic analysis of it. And, I'll use this approach. And they'll go, well, you're putting in a price that's nowhere near the current price. Nobody will think that it's right. It will look, and you go, well, if people are going to adopt this with the idea that the current price is what's going to prevail flat for the next 3 to 5 years of their adoption platform, then, you know, the current price is the one to use. But we have to do a lot of education around that. So let me show you what those distributions then look like. This is the total amount. These are the marginal changes. So you see the cost of production of the animals dropping. Corn is reducing by this amount at each step in pounds. Soybean meal by this amount. DDGS going up. I have it in the title instead of having negative signs there. So in our example, that 336, which was when we got up to 30% DDGS, we could knock 336 off the price per pig. That's really the mean of a distribution of outcomes of the corn and the soybean meal, you see. So if you tried it at any one given time over the next 3 to 5 years, you might actually lose money, and a very small number of times your production would go, costs go up by $4, or not reduce, whichever one side that is. And sometimes it'd be a $10 deal, but very, very rarely that's the flat part of this curve. Most of the time, and the central density is going to put us at 336. So you see, it's just the new way. I think producers have to begin to switch gears in the way we think about, should I use this input or should I not use that input? If you just say, well, what's the price? And corn and soybean meal or this, well, hell, that don't work. May not work this afternoon, but, you know, most adoptions, you need to look at what, you know, the range prices are going to go over their distribution over the period of the adoption. And then decide, you know, what the likely change in your profitability, which will be a distribution like this, will be. And then we can say, well, 2% of the time it could be a disaster if you made this adoption. And or we can begin summing this up, like this is 5% of the distribution, this line. 5% of the outcomes were over $6.12. 5% were below zero, that is, had no effect in lowering price. But 90% of the time, we would expect it to be between 0 and 6.12. So see, all of a sudden you begin to kind of get a range there. That's what dating is all about, right? You're trying to sample the distribution, right? My daughter is dating this guy now for a long period of time. She was like Ellie Mae Clampett. She thought when she was 18 that she was, you know, over the hill or something. She's been really 25. Been really worried about this, and so now she finally has this guy that's, you know, 7 or 8 months. They've really been going together, and so on. And I explained this to her in this way. I said, look, you're sampling the distribution. So, you know, sometimes he's going to be uncaring appearing, and sometimes he's going to be more than you thought he could ever be, and then there's going to be that. So see if the mean is going to be around something you can put up with for a long period of time. Right? Kind of what we're looking at. There, see? You can see how hog production is related to every other part of life. I probably told you this story before, but when John was in school, I taught a marketing course at Iowa State, and the first day of class, I told the students that I was going to show them how hog prices were related to the movements of the planets and the stars. And I'd have a few people come up at the end of the class and go, can we still get a full refund on our books if we drop this class? And I said, well, of course. Well, seasonal price patterns in hogs are, you know, repeating every 12 months, are related to seasonal infertility, you know, which is the amount of sunlight which interacts with the pituitary gland and some other gland in the sow or whatever goes on there. Kind of like, you know, we know hogs are seasonal breeders, right? Like deer and everything else. So very much so, when you see those summer patterns and winter patterns, they're tracing out for you the movement of the Earth around the sun in a very repeating every 12-month kind of pattern. So your industry is more connected to things than you would expect, including your choice of spouse and everything else probably. So instead of giving these point estimates here of adding 10, 20, and 30% DDGS, put little distributions up there and say 10%, 20%, 30% gets you these likely outcomes. And these are more like the form of the reports that I produce for my clients now rather than these point estimates. Okay? So it's a consciousness raising session today on why you need to think of the world in terms of distributions. And it'll drive your doctor crazy too if you do a little research and find out, that you've been working so hard to get your cholesterol 10 points lower, and it turns out that it's perfectly normal for you. So keep that in mind when you see all these borderlines. Plus, we go around and around with the doctor about politicized medicine. They keep dumbing down the level of blood pressure and blood sugar and all that so that more people can be sick, and have to come back every quarter. He wants me to come back every quarter now that I'm 60, and I say, no, once a year is all you get. And then he threatens to withhold my blood pressure medicine. I mean, we kind of go around. But anyway, I told him I'm single-handedly going to turn medicine back into a consumer-driven product where you were the consultant and I, because I have the most at stake, drive my own health care with your consultation. So that means you can't just hand me a slip for the lab without saying anything and go, you make me take it and bring it back, pay for it, and then some LPN calls me and tells me it's all okay. I don't want that. I want to know what each individual test found out from you. You can see what a pain in the ass I am. Well, demand for corn now requires this near record production, or we could run out toward the end of the summer time. And when we get to that end of the summer, that can be really disastrous, because if you are, the availability, for instance, of DDGS as a substitute, and the trade-off with corn, and with no corn available, you have to begin putting the ethanol byproduct in there because they're taking the corn away, and then the packer is ready to have a fit. All of this has happened in the last year in various places around the country when stocks-to-use issues arise. So it becomes something that we have to look at as a risky choice.